again, Richard Hill from the Mind Science Institute, here talking about what's interesting, what's coming up. And I'm going to sort of keep on this idea of this interplay between body and brain. And there was an interesting article I saw. It was actually again from my friend Alan Ivey, talking about chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, chronic fatigue, that was the wonderful thing that people had that was not really a disease, where it was all in your head, it didn't really exist. But of course, like so many of these things, what we're doing now in neuroscience is saying, okay, what is it that you have, and how is it that the brain manifests this expression, this sense of wellness or sense of illness? And chronic fatigue, there's no doubt about the fact that people had enormous problems. And let me see, we talked about the late 80s, and just referring to some of this article. Exhausted from time to time. Sometimes you felt okay, sometimes you just couldn't move yourselves. Suffered from aches and pains on occasions. Sometimes it was terrible and unbearable, and other times it was fine. And also foggy days. Well, there we are. What have we got? We've got exhaustion. We've got tiredness. So we've got issues going on in the brain with energy. So perhaps we've got issues going on with our ATP, our adenosine triphosphate processes. We've got aches and pains. So we've got issues going on the anterior cingulate. We've got issues going on in the thalamus. We've got foggy days. So we've got issues going on with the prefrontal cortex and some of the connectives, so perhaps with GABAergic, perhaps dopaminergic systems. There's lots of information that comes from these cues. And in the Journal of Nuclear Medicine, just come out, Nakatomi as the lead author, but the really the supportive guy, Watanabe, has been doing lots of this wonderful work. And they're talking about inflammatory processes in the brain. Let's look at the inflammatory processes in the brain. And this has become a huge thing now, and I'm talking about it lots and lots. And the nature of the way the brain responds to inflammatory processes in the body, and the way the inflammatory processes in the brain affect the nature of the way the brain functions. Now, inflammatory markers, and this is what Watanabe and Nakatomi were looking at. They're looking at inflammatory markers in the brain for people with this chronic fatigue type syndrome, or some of the elements that were similar to that, and then those, of course, that didn't have any problems. And they're looking at the cytokines. Now, they're your inflammatory markers, your interleukins. Not all interleukins. I mean, some interleukins are anti-inflammatory, but interleukin 1, 2, 6, there's some of the damaging ones, and tumor necrosis factor. Now, they were looking at those, and guess what? And I love this here. They found more of these markers in the thalamus, in the cingulate cortex, in individuals who reported worse pain. They found inflammation in the hippocampus for patients with severe depression, and lower levels of serotonin transporters and these excessive cytokines in the blood. And a lot of that leads you to think we've got problems in the prefrontal cortex and in the area there, this dysexecutive syndrome, which I should do a bit more of a talk about, because that's an incredibly important understanding to have when you're dealing with affective disorders and the nature of the neuroscience. So what's interesting, these guys are now planning to study anti-inflammatory agents, so that would be medications, but also herbal remedies. And then we come to the situation of, well, what is it that creates inflammation? Of course, one of the biggest things that causes chronic inflammation around the body, and the body thinking that something wrong for it, and therefore lifting up the interleukins and the tumor necrosis factor, of course, is chronic states of cortisol coming from stress, or also some of the chronic issues that come from the inflammatory processes caused by overeating, by obesity, and also by lack of exercise. There's a whole interplay going on here, and I'm going to write a little bit of something about this for the Neuropsychotherapist magazine, the interplay between brain, heart, and body. So keep an eye out for that. That's coming out in July. So what's coming up? Just quickly, here's a great one. This is a nice webinar. You're free to access. Rick Hansen, who does a lot of work with mindfulness and balance of body and neuroscience, is doing a series of interviews with some really interesting experts. I'll give the website. It's found on Entheos, ENTHEOS.com, and called Hardwiring Happiness. And it's got my friend Stephen Porges is on there, which is great. I'm leafing through I'm getting to that age where you have to lick your thumb to get through things. Todd Kashdan, who some people are starting to get to know quite well. Sharon Salzberg. Lots of interesting people, about 8 of those, and you can just sort of pump into that and get a good thing about hardwiring happiness. Well, that's enough for today. Let's keep an eye on this body, this inflammation, this inflammatory processes, and of course, what hasn't even been talked about in Watanabe stuff is then what happens with microglia. What are microglia doing? Because they're the ones that are triggered and stimulated when we have inflammatory markers. We have these interleukins and tumor necrosis factor getting increased expression in the brain. So that's it for now. Keep up all your thinking and your joy. Create something wonderful and do something grand, and be amazed and wondered and wonderful always. Bye for now.
Well, hello again there, Matthew. I hope everything is going swimmingly down under. This is Dr. Dave once again. So happy to have this opportunity to speak with your audience and to kind of share our work together. And I'm here today to talk about my most recent podcast interview, which is number 407, and it is with a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, Dr. Bridget, not doctor, I'm so in the habit of saying that. She is a journalist and not a doctor. However, she is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist for the Washington Post. And as a matter of fact, the story that she was part of a team for was on the Virginia Tech massacre, a college rampage shooting, which unfortunately has become all too common in this country. And it's due to our lax gun laws, I'm afraid. It's a very sad situation. It's not a week goes by that we don't have something like that going on now. So I was thinking about this a little bit, and since there are people out there maybe who are contemplating doctoral dissertations and such, I think this is something that needs to be studied. And my own hunch about how to make forward progress on it, the thing that has blocked progress is the NRA, the National Rifle Association, which has a very strong lobby in this country. At the same time, though, I find it hard to believe that everybody in the National Rifle Association, that everybody would be of one mind. There must be some people of conscience who think that this has gone too far and that we don't all need assault rifles, and that all members of the NRA, I'm sure many are just hunters and not so much worried about a government takeover that they have to be armed to the teeth to oppose the government. So as I was thinking about this, I was trying to think, well, how might psychologists or other sorts of activists splinter that group somehow, divide those camps so that there could be a vocal camp within the NRA who would oppose the overall direction of the organization. Well, I've gone far afield here from the podcast that I wanted to tell you about. It's number 407. As I said, it's by Bridget Schulte, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning author. And the book that she's just come out with is called Overwhelmed. And actually, that is an appropriate title for what I was just talking about, because I'm overwhelmed, and many of us in this country are overwhelmed by this situation. But she's talking about overwhelmed by being too busy. And I think this is a problem, actually. It's especially acute here in the U.S., but it's not just us. And countries that have been influenced by American culture, I think, are prone to follow in this direction as well. The title again is Overwhelmed: Work, Love, and Play When No One Has the Time. And the author is Brigid Schulte. This is what the book looks like, so you kind of see it. And so, it's really about how we get ourselves stressed out by way too much work, not enough vacation time. And personally, she explores it quite deeply and looks at a number of factors that contribute to that. But my personal favorite devil in this regard is technology. As much of a technophile as I am, counting on technology to get my podcast across, to be able to communicate with you and the rest of the world, at the same time, I think we're increasingly aware that there are many shadow aspects of technology. And one is just that it's a great time sponge. When the technology first came along, computer technology in particular, it had the promise of being a great time saver in my own life. Now I can accomplish so much more. And I think many of us sort of took it up with that kind of spirit. Well, the thing is, because we could accomplish more, both others and we ourselves began to expect more of ourselves. So the bosses said, "Oh, well, you don't need a secretary. You're going to be you can do all your own typing now, and you can put out your own newsletter, and and I can do a podcast all by myself," and so on. It just magnifies and magnifies to the place where I am now a so-called retired person, but spend an enormous amount of time with this technology. Hey, it's kind of fun to go off on a rant. Usually I keep these pretty short, but this will let your audience get to know me a little better by revealing myself in this way. Well, to shorten it up a bit, her antidote, her suggested antidote, because this book was born out of the busyness of her own life, of being a woman, a wife, a mother of, I think, 4 children, and a career journalist, and trying to juggle all those balls. So she was really trying to understand if this was just her or if this was a more endemic sort of problem, and to understand all the factors that go into it, and then how might we cope with it. And the way that she found to cope with it was she took some workshops and studied with some people who were involved in mindfulness research and practice. And that seemed to help her create some, at least, mental space and to de-stress a bit in her own life. And so I've titled this episode, Mindfulness as an Antidote for the Busyness Epidemic. And as with these other books that I've been reviewing, written by journalists, they really do their homework, and that's one of the things I like about it. So she went to some of the major research labs, she met with brain scientists and so on. So I know that this episode and this book will be of interest to you and your audience. And so with that, it's back to you, Matthew.